Good morning and welcome again to the remote services of Wildwood Baptist Church. My name is Bill Vest, and I want to welcome any of you who are not part of Wildwood Baptist Church to our services during this time of quarantine. If you happen to have been listening to the last few messages, you know that we have been talking about using this time to properly prioritize our lives with God, with our family, with our jobs, with ourselves, with everything. But we're going to take a break this week and next week, this week being Palm Sunday and then next week being Easter, to look at why this change, why this ability to be better, to become who God would have us to be is possible, and how it is made possible by Jesus Christ. This morning, what I want to do is to give a huge overview of the first 4 chapters of John. Now, that is, if you are familiar with me at all, that is not my forte. My forte is taking one verse and breaking it apart for weeks, and looking at 4 chapters at one time will be somewhat difficult for me, so I pray that you would bear with me as we prepare for Easter. Now, John, in these first 4 chapters, tells how Jesus is bringing full and complete cleansing for mankind. That is what his purpose is in these chapters. He is laying down a foundation for not only our redemption, but our recreation, and then our ability to fulfill our created and then recreated purpose. John's gospel is different than the synoptic gospels because he does not include things like Jesus's birth. He doesn't include the story of Jesus's baptism, his temptation in the wilderness for 40 days. He has none of the stories of Jesus confronting demons. John includes no parables. You don't have the story of the Last Supper. You don't have the story of Jesus' struggle in Gethsemane over his will and God's will. You don't even have the story of his ascension to the Father and his place alongside the throne. And the question that immediately arises is, why is this gospel different than the others? Primarily, it is different because John is concerned with 2 things. Almost exclusively, he is concerned with getting across 2 messages and giving every bit of evidence he can toward them, that we might truly understand the mission of God, the teachings of God, and then the result of what God has done for us. In John 1:14, he kind of gives the thesis statement for the whole of his book whenever he says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." Now, the 2 things that John is worried about or concerned about, why he is writing his gospel, is so that we might believe. He says that in the last 2 verses of this chapter, of this book. But here we see those 2 things broken down. He is concerned with the glory of Jesus and its corresponding truth in revealing what God's desires truly are. The teaching of God since the fall of man had been twisted primarily for man's own selfish purposes and his own reasons to accomplish what man desired rather than what God desired. And so you have that first purpose to reveal Jesus's glory and the truth that comes from God. Secondly, he reveals how this truth can rescue us, not only from the mess that man is in, but the mess that man revels in being in. We are not only in a mess, for the most part, we enjoy it and we add to it. And John is trying to reveal how Jesus taught a new and a better way for man. So now with that thesis statement in mind, I want us to move to chapter 2. John starts his record of Jesus' ministry at a wedding. Verse 1. And on the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Now jump down to verse number 10, and we read, and said to him, this is speaking to the host of the wedding, and they said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now. This, John writes, is the first of Jesus's signs. This is the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory. And his disciples believed in him. Now, there are two reasons why John begins his report, his expose, his exposition of the teaching of the life of Christ at this wedding. I think one of them is because we are thick. It is hard to not only teach us a lesson, but for us to learn it and then to apply it in our lives. And we come up with all kinds of wrong thinking about God. And so Jesus begins his ministry at a wedding. And then the very end of Jesus' ministry, it finds its consummation at another wedding that we know of as the marriage supper of the Lamb. This beginning and ending, these brackets that hold Jesus' ministry both on earth and ongoing now until all who are redeemed, being at a wedding and then ending at a wedding is revealing to us God's desire. It is not our punishment. It is not our banishment. In fact, God desires the closest possible communion with his creation, even his rebellious creation. We who are blind, and we who are poor, and we who are lame, and we who are intellectually arrogant, and we who not only are the victims of the fall, but willing participants in it. God longs to redeem, and not just to redeem and then to keep us as trophies or to let us go on our own merry way. His desire is to be with us in the most intimate and the most personal and the most eternal way possible. So Jesus' ministry is recorded as beginning at a wedding and then finding its consummation at a wedding. Secondly, I think that John is using this wedding at Cana as a small example to teach a giant truth. In the wedding at Cana, you find a small tragedy taking place during the wedding. The last invitees to the wedding would be the poorest, those who could not travel quickly or could not stay for the days-long feast that would accompany a wedding during that day. And the fact that the host of the feast would run out of resources would bring great dishonor to him, and by extension to his son or his daughter, and to his son and his daughter-in-law. It would bring great dishonor to him to run out of resources, to not have what is needed for the people who have arrived, who have responded to the invitation. Now, as you read these intervening verses, you'll find what Jesus does is his mother comes to him and asks him to take care of the problem. And so Jesus calls for 6 large empty pots that normally would hold 20 to 30 gallons of water. And these pots that are filled with what is, he asks them first to fill them with water, with what is not needed. And then he turns the water into wine, and not only wine, but the best wine, providing provision for all. And not only does he save face for the host, because he makes this the best wine, he not only rescues him from losing face, he causes it to where the host of this feast would receive honor. He provides for him honor. Now, John says that this is a sign revealing the ministry of Christ, a picture of communion that he has come to provide for God and for man. For God, his desire to be with man and to commune with man, and then to provide for man in providing what man cannot provide for himself. Our resources, our provisions will always fall short or simply be the wrong thing. And so here you have a living parable, as it were. You have an illustration of what Jesus has come to do, to provide God's desires, to fulfill God's desires by providing for man what man cannot provide for himself. We know that Paul later on will give commentary to this by saying, we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Something that man could never do for himself is revealed here. Something that man could never produce for himself, Jesus provides. Now, after this first story that reveals that Jesus can turn tragedy into triumph, here a very small tragedy, and then of course the fallen nature of man and our movement toward inevitable death, the true tragedy, Jesus is showing that he can turn tragedy, no matter how small or no matter how profound, into triumph. But this passage also reveals the love of God and how inexhaustible his power is. No matter how many may come to the wedding, no matter how many people may respond to the invitation, Christ is there to provide not only what is needed, but the best, more than what is needed. A triumphant feast to share his honor and his glory with us. The desire and the purpose of God are put on full display in this story. Now, in the second part of this chapter, as we move on, we see the failure and the inability of man put on display. Look at verses 12 and 13. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and he stayed there a few days. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. After the sign at Cana, Jesus turns his attention to the temple. Now Jesus, the synoptics tell us, has been going to the temple at this time every year. From his childhood, he has observed how men have transformed and redefined the ordinance that the Father had instituted to humble man, to aid man, to remind man of what his rebellion costs. Now verses 14 and 15. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeon, and the money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. You can see Jesus in this instance observing what is going on at the temple. He has encountered it every year from his youth, and how man has completely and utterly destroyed the picture that God was revealing in the first Passover. And how he is sitting over in the leather shop and he is braiding a whip of leather. And finally, when the time was right, he lets his anger, without sin, drive the men out of the temple who have destroyed the temple by their own selfishness, by their own desires, by their own actions. And he cleanses the temple. And Jesus clears the temple of everyone but himself. Look at that word all there in the middle of these verses. He cleared everyone out, including the animals. Why? Because in the Old Testament, when God told Moses to build the tabernacle and then within it the Holy of Holies, God took up residence there. The temple was a picture of God residing with men. In fact, if we went back in chapter 1, we would see that the word Jesus dwelt among us, the word is literally tabernacled with us. And so if the temple is to be seen as the abode of God, the only person who has the right, the only person who is pure enough, the only person who is capable of being in the presence of God is Jesus himself. Again, it is a living picture. No one is good enough. No one has the right. Everyone has been expelled from the presence of God, and no one can enter into it save Christ. He alone can commune with God. So in the first part of this chapter, we find that God's desire is to commune with man. And then in the latter part of this chapter, we find that the only person who can commune with God is Jesus, the Son of God. And so something has to take place if God is going to have his desires fulfilled and man is to be redeemed. God's intentions are revealed at the wedding of Cana, grace and communion for any who would respond to him. And then in the latter part, we see that man's desires are revealed in Jerusalem. They have taken the house of God and turned it into a house of selfishness, a house of separation as they restrict more and more and more and more who can enter into the presence of God. They have even turned the house of the Lord into a place of anger rather than love and redemption and forgiveness. And all of this results in judgment as Jesus takes this cord of leather and drives everyone out save himself. Look at these verses again in verses 14 and 15. In the temple he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons and the money changers sitting there. And he made a whip of cords and drove them all out of the temple, even the sheep and the oxen, poured out the coins of the money changers, and overturned their tables. Now I want you to notice what is not in these verses. While John calls the turning of water into wine at Cana a sign, this is not referred to as a sign. Why? Because this action of Jesus, other men might be able to do it. In fact, the Jewish celebration of Hanukkah is a celebration of when Judas Maccabeus did just this thing. He drove out the corruption of the temple and restored it for Israel. You could almost see Peter with the stories of his strength and of his anger and of his willingness even to take on all of the soldiers in the Garden of Gethsemane with just one sword. You could picture Peter in a moment of pique, in a moment of anger, trying to drive these people out. And so this is not considered a sign because others may be able to do it, at least physically. But I want you to look at verses 18 through 21. Now the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things? Where do you get your authority to do this? What sign do you show us?" And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." And then man reveals his ignorance here by saying in verse number 20, the Jews said to him, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" But Jesus was talking about the temple of his body. In fact, in verse number 21, it says that when Jesus was raised on the 3rd day, which we'll look at next week at Easter, that his disciples understood these things and believed. Pardon me, I think that's verse 22. But while some may be able to cleanse the temple physically, some may be able to bully others, it will have no true lasting effect. It takes God to truly bring about change, lasting change, through not only strength, but also truth and the power of resurrection. The old covenant temple here is rendered finished. In fact, in the Old Testament, it had already been rendered powerless as the Spirit of the Lord had ascended from it. But here, Jesus declares the power of the temple has finished. And Jesus is going to institute, as we said a couple of weeks ago, a new covenant. Jesus offers here, it promises here, a new, a better temple that no man can ruin, that no man can overtake, that no man can conquer and put his own desires, his own selfishness, his own ruin to it. Jesus promises a temple not only that no man can ruin, but in fact will ruin the ongoing ruination of man. It is an incredible promise whenever we see it. And now with at least a seminal understanding, a partial understanding of chapter 2, let's move on and look very quickly at chapter 3, where Jesus has an encounter with the teacher of Israel, a man named Nicodemus. Now I want to begin chapter 3, actually in chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse number 25. Jesus is said in verse number 24 that he did not commit himself to the people who believed the signs, but not in Jesus. And he needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. And then chapter 3, verse number 1 says, now there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. Now at that time, to be a Pharisee, you had to be a man, and everyone knew it. Nicodemus was most definitely a male name. And to be a ruler among the Jews, again, you had to be a man. So that first phrase there is superfluous. There was a man of the Pharisees. Why does he say a man? Because he is reckoning back to the previous verse. Jesus knew what was in man. Now here comes this man, Nicodemus, and they have their discussion. Now today we're just going to look at this in a very cursory manner. We're going to use some devotions as we go forward to take this chapter apart so that we might see even more of its beauty. But where the teaching of the cleansing of the temple is immediately followed by what I believe chapter 3 is all about. The cleansing of the teaching of the temple. It is one thing to cleanse the temple physically. It is quite another thing to cleanse the teaching of the temple. And here we have Jesus carrying out a conversation with the teacher of Israel. Verse number 2. This man, again, that reference. This man came to Jesus by night and said to him, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. And Jesus answered him, truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. In verse 2, Nicodemus and at least a group of the Pharisees, in their arrogance, now inadvertent arrogance I believe, but arrogance revealed nonetheless, think that they have the right to stand in judgment of Jesus. To stand in judgment of him, to say that he is one who comes from God. They have seen the signs, and they say, we know that God is with you. They deign to stand in judgment of Jesus, and yet they get it wrong. It is not the signs that matter, it's the person that matters. And it's not that God is with him. God has come to be with us. Jesus is God. And he has come to dwell with us in a way that is incorruptible by man. In fact, in a way that will undo the corruption of man and wipe our slate completely clean and give us a whole and a brand new start. We are born again. And in verse number 3, Jesus in one statement rocks everything that the teacher of Israel, that the whole temple is built around. Jesus rocks in one statement everything that Nicodemus holds to be true. Any pastor will tell you that the conversion of Nicodemus and then later on the conversion of Paul are probably the most astounding in all of the scriptures. Because the hardest thing for any pastor to teach is to unteach an error that someone has believed their whole life. The hardest thing for any pastor to do is to unteach something that someone has believed to be true their whole lives. And so it is truly astounding what eventually takes place with Nicodemus. Now, it doesn't happen here in chapter 3. We see another encounter with him in chapter 7, and then next week we'll see where Nicodemus finally comes out of the shadow and pronounces that he is a disciple of Christ. But what Jesus is saying with this encounter with Nicodemus is, Nicodemus, you really need to understand something. And not only you, but all men. Either your jar is empty, referring back to the wedding at Cana, or anything you may have put in it is of no value in changing the situation. Water would not have rescued the host's face or his honor in chapter 2. And anything that we might put in our jar to present to God, as it were, would be of no value in providing us redemption. And so Jesus in verse 3 teaches an incredibly radical thing. There is nothing that you can do that will positively, permanently, eternally change your situation. Look at now what he goes on to say in verse number 6. He says, Nicodemus, don't be astounded that I say to you that you must be born again. This is a principle of nature. Verse 6, that which is born of flesh is flesh, that which is born of the Spirit is the Spirit. Do not marvel that I say to you, you must be born again. Now we know this principle. Cows give birth to cows. Birds give birth to birds. Strawberries produce strawberries. Gourds produce gourds. Like produces like. Kind produces kind. So human beings produce earthly beings. And we humans are by nature selfish, sinful, and rebellious. Oh no, we may have episodes in our lives where we overcome these things, but in our heart, at our core, this is who we are. So then the question is, how can God's desire be fulfilled, and how can man have hope? Because of probably the greatest verse ever written. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. You have in John 3:16 the most astounding of all promises. It is more beautiful than tongue can tell. It is more awesome than pen can write about. It is beyond the philosophies of man. It is beyond the poetry of man. It's beyond the artistry of man. It is absolutely divinely gorgeous. But it is not only that. It is also a cleansing of the teaching of the temple that Jesus has just cleansed. Where he cleansed it physically in chapter 2, he is cleansing it intellectually or philosophically in its teaching in chapter 3. And he is simultaneously establishing the teaching of the new temple that he promised to build, the temple of his own body. How does it cleanse the teaching of the temple? In that very first phrase, for God so loved, I think it's read, the world. God so loved. God first loves us. We respond to him. He does not respond to us. God makes the first step. We love him because he first loved us. Now those words in red there, the world. This is undoing the whole teaching that the Jews held dear. Now, it was not what Jesus taught in the beginning. When he called Abraham, he said, Abraham, I am blessing you in order that you might be a blessing to the whole world. But man immediately corrupted that, and the Jews thought themselves special. They thought themselves uniquely qualified to be the children of God, and they alone. And now Jesus says, God loves the world. Not a select bloodline, and not a religious elite like Nicodemus is a part of. He loves the world. That he gave his only Son. Now to Nicodemus, this would have undone everything that he had learned and everything that he had worked for, everything that he had sacrificed for his whole life. Salvation is not something that we earn. It is not something that we merit. Redemption is a gift. It is not our sacrifice that matters, but it is the sacrifice of the giver that matters. Everything that he has put in his jar is of no value to remedy the situation. But God can come and not only turn water into wine, but to turn a rebel into a son. To turn a dying man into one who is renewed with life every day, who is becoming more alive. And this is offered us, not by our sacrifice, but simply by our trust in him. Not a system of works, not a worldview of exclusivity, but simply trusting God. So you have the teaching of the Jewish nation as a whole cleansed. You have the teaching of the Pharisees cleansed. And then those words in green there, should not perish, but have everlasting life, cleanses the teaching of the other major sect of the Jews in that time, the Sadducees. Those who thought that they were rational, that they were logical, that all of this miracle stuff doesn't make any sense. Now let me take it aside for just a moment. I know that there are a lot of you out there who believe that you can't believe the Bible because it doesn't make scientific sense. Well, that's looking at it completely wrong. That is Nicodemus in verse 2, and then Jesus' correction in the following verses. The Bible is not a book of natural science. And even we pastors, sometimes we want to walk down that line. It's not a book of natural science. What the Bible is the story of a supernatural rescue of the natural world. We will never make sense of it with our philosophies, with our understandings, with our tests. It is a belief that God is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. A rewarder of them that take the faith that he provides and exercise it in trust with him. And when we do that, he says we should not perish, but have everlasting life. The Sadducees did not think there was anything beyond this world. Therefore, they didn't feel like they had to be careful how they lived in this world. And Jesus is saying that life is eternal. Therefore, every action, every moment, every interaction that we have in this life matters because it extends into eternity. That's one of the great beauties of our salvation, is that now we can begin to live lives that matter, to help one another, and not in a moment, not in a time, not when we feel good, or we are flush with money, or we're feeling guilty or whatever, but that we can truly live lives that are pleasing to God as we love one another, as we aid one another. We truly can be changed from the rebellious, selfish people that we had become in the fall. Like produces like. I am now born of God. Therefore, I can fulfill my created purpose to be like God. Now, it will take me an eternity to get there, right? But the process has begun now, and it is up to me to learn to exercise that, to live for God by aiding, by helping, by teaching, by encouraging one another, weeping with them that weep, rejoicing with them that rejoice. Those who know love to love, right? That is the principle by which we can see the rational part, the measurable part, the logical part of the gospel. Not that the gospel doesn't make logical sense. We'll talk about that next week. But what the things that we can measure. Now look at verse number 17. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Jesus goes on to say that in this chapter that he didn't come to condemn the world because it's condemned already. And he's telling Nicodemus, you can't earn a good outcome in a trial that has already taken place. God made us to be like him, and we are not. Therefore, we have deviated from, we have broken from the law of God that we would love God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love our neighbor as ourselves. We have broken from that, and the only remedy for that is our expulsion, our separation from God. You can't earn a good outcome in a trial that has already taken place. But be of good cheer, Nicodemus. I did not come into this world to condemn it. It's condemned already. What I have come to do is to be condemned for the condemned. I did not come into this world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through the Son. He didn't come to condemn the world, but to be condemned for the condemned, that the condemned might be redeemed and made into the very bride that God will bring to that final wedding, that marriage supper of the Lamb. I see that I've already taken a lot of time, so I won't do chapter 4. But what you have in chapter 4 is Jesus dealing with an outcast woman at a well. And what she is concerned about is the place. She is from Samaria. The Jews have forbidden them from going to the temple, the place where they believed that God dwelt. And how could she ever come into communion with him? How could she ever offer a proper sacrifice? And Jesus is saying, listen, it's not the place that matters, it's the person. just like to Nicodemus, it's not the system that matters. It is the person that matters. To the woman at the well, it's not the place that matters. It's the person that matters. This is how the world can be saved by him. Because where is Jesus? Wherever anybody calls out for him. Where is God? He is Christ. And for anyone who calls out for the remedy, he is there not to give us just enough, but to give the best. It's a glorious thing. He doesn't give us just enough to skate by. He gives the best to us. All that he is, the glory that he deserves, he gives to me. Therefore, I should worship him. And a man like that, I should endeavor with all that is in me to emulate. May God begin that in my life right now. If you have any questions, have any concerns, if you have prayer requests, you have needs, contact us at Wildwood Baptist Church in Englewood, Tennessee. Or go to our website and you can leave a message there, wildwoodbc.com. I thank you. And I pray that we would have our eyes opened, that we might see not only the rescue of Christ, but the glorious salvation that he offers us, that results in our adoption and our change, that we might become who God intended us to be all along. Thank you, and good morning.